Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Suman. In this video, we are going to discuss about Node.js Buffer and how we can utilize those things in our application. We are going to cover introduction of Node.js Buffer, creating an initializing buffer different methods and operations, and how it is useful for performance and best practices. So what is buffer? So in terms of operating system concept, buffer is a temporary memory which is part of the primary memory, which is basically used for the faster operation, and it is used for storing temporary data. So when we need some small amount of data, we want to store somewhere temporarily and we need fast read and write, then we should use the buffer. What is buffer in Node.js? So Node.js Buffer is a library or class which allows Node.js program to access buffer and read and write string or any information as a binary format in the buffer. So buffer is a global class to the Node.js, so we do not have to include anything or require anything in our class. We can directly use the buffer class, and I can call the different methods that are there in the buffer class. So when we use buffer, so buffer is used widely in modern web application and many other networking application, binary data processing, streaming data, file uploading, file processing, TCP, UDP packet processing. So all kind of operations we use buffer. So now let's discuss some of the common methods that are useful for the buffer. So we start with creating a buffer. So here you can see one string named node. I am storing in the buffer as a binary format, calling the form method. So again, the buffer is a global class, so we do not have to require or include anything. We can directly use buffer and call the methods associated with the buffer. Second method, buffer.alloc. So what we are doing is that we are creating a buffer of length 10 and all the bytes are initialized to 0. And here one thing you have to remember, this is a safe for sensitive data because it avoids leaking of old memory contents. So there is another method called alloc unsafe, so which is faster than the alloc method, but in this case alloc unsafe basically if I provide 10 to the alloc unsafe, it creates a buffer with 10 byte buffer, but it does not initialize anything. It can contain old left out values of the other buffer. So if somebody directly use alloc unsafe and directly try to print this one, it might give you some wrong information. So you have to make sure you clear the entire buffer and assign a particular value to alloc unsafe when you are utilizing. So buffer allows indexed access to the individual bytes. So consider I have created one buffer and stored the string ABC in the buffer, and if I now access buffer 0, so which is the first byte of the buffer which points to A, and it will return 65, which is the answer for the A basically. And if I now assign something in buffer 1, and this value basically we are basically replacing the original buffer and replacing the original value of the buffer. Let's discuss some other methods and properties of buffer. So in this small example, what we are doing, we are creating a buffer having length of 5 bytes and all initialized to 0. Then I'm calling the fill method. So what fill method does, it will fill the buffer A, so it would be 5 times A, and then I'm creating another buffer which having byte length 5, and then on top of buff I'm calling copy and putting buff 2. So basically I'm copying value of buff to the buff 2. So if I print both of the values, so both basically will print 5 times A basically. So this is how we can copy a value from a buffer to the another buffer. So let's discuss the property length of the buffer. So there is a property length for the buffer which basically returns number of bytes of the buffer, not the number of characters of the buffer what we are storing. So in this case, test is a string which I am storing in the buffer, and on top of buffer if I call length, it will provide 4. So how this is calculated is that, so test, if I go character by character. So T is 1 byte, E is 1 byte, S is 1 byte, and this small t is also 1 byte. So total is 4 bytes. So it will return 4, but it does not mean this is the length of the string. This is the number of bytes what has been allocated to the buffer. So buffer supports multiple encoding formats. So when we are storing the values strings, basically the strings in the buffer, we can define the encoding format. So there are multiple encoding formats that are supported in the buffer. So one of first default is UTF-8, then ASCII and base 64 and hex, and finally the deprecated one was the binary one. So if we don't define any encoding format, so it would be UTF-8, and explicitly also we can specify the encoding format. So let's have some example. So suppose I want to store hello in the buffer and I want to define the character set as ASCII. I can provide that in the second parameter. Similarly, here I want to store it as a base 64. And when I'm printing that back to, so basically that will return the base 64 value of hello. And similarly, this will basically we are storing as a hex, and this is as a binary. When we are printing the values of the buffer, that time also we can define the encoding formats. Again, by default, if you don't provide anything, it is UTF-8, and rather than UTF-8, if you provide any other values like ASCII or base 64 hex, the buffer value would be converted to the corresponding values, and that would be displayed. Now let's discuss some few more methods of the buffer which are commonly used. So toString, we have already discussed that if I want to print the buffer values or I want to convert the buffer to string, I can use the toString. Here first parameter is the encoding. Default parameter of this is basically the UTF-8, and then I can provide the start and ending. So if I provide here 0 to 4 and Node.js is my string, so basically it will return from 0th position to the 4th position, which is node. So it will return node. Similarly, like there's a method called write. So it is kind of like when we want to store some values to the buffer. So I have created a buffer which can hold 10 bytes of data, and on the first 2 bytes I am writing high, and that is what I am printing basically. Next, like if I want to slice a array, I can use the method called subarray. So suppose I have stored Node.js in the buffer, and I want to basically slice or trim or basically like slice the array, slice the values of the buffer. So if I put start and end position like 0 to 4, so it would be basically print node in as a out. Next, equals is used to compare to buffer. So in this case, buffer A and buffer B is identical because they have same values, so it will return true. Similarly, there is another function called copy, so which I think we have already seen. So if I want to copy a buffer to another buffer, I can do that. So source is a buffer which contains the value ABCD, and the destination is an empty buffer which can hold 4 bytes of data. And here I am copying the source buffer to the destination buffer, and at the end, if I print the destination buffer, it will basically display the same data which is ABCD. So next topic is buffer in stream. So stream is a concept in Node.js which is basically used to handle large amount of data in chunks. So using stream, we read data and we write data in smaller chunks, and we can handle large amount of data set, large amount of files. And this stream is basically internally used buffer for read-write operations. So the read stream, which is basically read data in a chunk, and the chunk basically that is written from the read stream is basically a buffer. And similarly for the write stream, when we are writing, so the write part also, the data that is written to the file, that is also managed through the buffer. So I just conclude what we have learned. So buffer is essential for handling binary data in Node.js. We learned how to create, read, write, and manipulate buffers, explored common methods, properties, and how we can use with streams, discuss encoding formats and performance best practices. So the key takeaway would be like the buffer.form and buffer.alloc and buffer.unsafe. So these are the three methods to create the buffer, and then there are certain methods which can be utilized to compare, copy, slice the buffer, and internally like the streams use the buffer as their key mechanism. So buffer is truly an important item in Node.js, which allows us to store data, temporary data in the buffer, which is part of the primary memory. So that's all in this video. Hope the information was useful. If you have any clarification doubt, please feel free to reach out. If you have not subscribed my channel, I request you to subscribe. Thank you.